On January 20th, 1949, the streets of Washington, D.C. teemed with people. More than 1 million Americans had traveled from across the country to attend President Truman's second inauguration. The New York Times described it as the grandest presidential inauguration since Roosevelt's New Deal in 1933. At the same time, millions of Americans were watching the ceremony on television for the very first time. But while the mood in the United States was celebratory, viewers watching from the Soviet Union were chilled to the bone. On their television screens, they saw bombers far larger than the two-four flying in formation over the Capitol. That massive aircraft, which stunned Soviet viewers, was the largest mass-produced piston-engine plane in history, the Convair B-36 Peacemaker. Its 10 engines generated as much power as 9 locomotives. Its wing fuel tanks carried enough gas to drive an automobile around the world 16 times. Its fuselage was as large as 3 small houses, and its wingspan exceeded even that of the Wright brothers' first flight. At the time, it was the U.S. Strategic Air Command's only means of countering the Soviet Union. It was hailed as the most effective, versatile weapon in the sky, the biggest, best bomber ever built. Yet, considering its history, this giant big-stick bomber was almost laughable in some ways. Its design was complex, its maintenance arduous, yet it was the safest aircraft of its era. In its brief 10 years of service, it never saw combat, yet it sank a supercarrier, killed a Navy secretary, and dropped a hydrogen bomb on American soil. Was this flying fortress truly a peacemaker, or was it simply another beautiful but useless toy? How did it spark the most serious internal conflict in U.S. military history? Today, let's explore the legendary story of the B-36. Development of the B-36 began in early 1941. The Allied remnants, led by Britain and France, had fallen back to the British Isles. Though officially neutral, it was obvious to all that the United States and Germany would soon be at war. The question was how, with Britain on the brink of collapse, America could cross the Atlantic and strike the Germany that had swallowed all of Europe. The U.S. Army Air Corps proposed developing an intercontinental strategic bomber capable of taking off from North America and striking Europe, an aircraft with a range of 19,000 kilometers. Unfortunately, building such a transcontinental bomber was far beyond engineers' imaginations at that time. Even after reducing the range requirement to 16,000 kilometers, it remained a monumental challenge. Throughout World War II, the B-36 development was repeatedly delayed. It did not make its first flight until August 20th, 1945, 5 days after Japan's surrender. With the dawn of the jet age, a prohibitively expensive piston-prop bomber seemed obsolete, unless someone was planning a nuclear war. And surely, nobody really intended to start a nuclear war, right? But after the Berlin blockade in 1948, U.S. and Soviet relations deteriorated rapidly. Facing the Iron Curtain, the nearly stillborn B-36 was hurried into service with a new mission. It became the linchpin of America's nuclear deterrent, ensuring that, even if overseas bases were lost, the U.S. could still strike the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. The most iconic feature of the B-36 was undoubtedly its enormous, thick wings. With a wingspan of 70.1 meters, 14 meters longer than the B-52, it remains the largest wingspan of any mass-produced military plane. The wing root thickness measured an astonishing 2.28 meters, roughly the height of Kobe Bryant's head plus a basketball. Inside those massive wings were enormous fuel tanks, plus access tunnels for mechanics to service the engines mid-flight. Speaking of engines, the B-36 configuration was unusual. It used a pusher layout, with propellers mounted behind the wing pushing the plane forward, similar to the XP-55 Ascender. This odd arrangement prevented propeller turbulence from disturbing airflow over the thick wings, reducing drag and boosting speed, necessary for a plane whose wings were thicker than some building walls. However, that layout also meant poor airflow around the engines, leading to overheating and even occasional onboard fires. Early production models used 6 Pratt & Whitney, our 4360 Wasp major radial engines. the largest displacement piston engines ever built in the U.S., with 28 cylinders each, producing up to 4,300 horsepower. Each engine drove a three-bladed propeller 5.8 meters in diameter. Beginning with the B-36D variant, Convair added two General Electric J-47 jet engines under each wingtip, the same model used on the F-86 Sabre. That brought the total to 10 engines per aircraft, 6 piston engines, and 4 jets. This earned the B-36 its famous slogan, 6 turning for burning, and made it the mass-produced plane with the most engines in history. Although simply adding more engines had diminishing returns and increased maintenance complexity, the extra 4 jet pods gave the B-36 nearly 40,000 horsepower on takeoff, drastically improving performance. The B-36D's takeoff run was shortened by over 600 meters, allowing it to operate from most U.S. Air Force bases. Takeoff and landing were originally a nightmare. The prototype XB-36 had single-wheel landing gear with tires 2.8 meters in diameter, the largest aircraft tires ever made. But the ground pressure was so high that XB-36 could only use 3 specially reinforced runways, including Eglin, where concrete was 55 centimeters thick and still sometimes tore up the runway. Production B-36 solved this with 4-wheel bogies, distributing weight more evenly. Convair even experimented with tank-style track landing gear for XB-36, but found the tracks too heavy and too loud on takeoff, so the idea was quickly abandoned. Whether it was those massive wings or the 10 engines, they all served one purpose: an immense payload. The B-36 4-bomb bays could carry up to 39 metric tons of bombs, 10 times what a B-17 Flying Fortress could carry. Without external hardpoints, that payload exceeded even modern B-52H and B-1B bombers. Although not designed for nuclear weapons initially, once operational, the B-36 instantly became the Strategic Air Command's nuclear workhorse. Before the B-52 entered service, it was the only U.S. plane capable of carrying the Mark 17 hydrogen bomb. The Mark 17 was 7.6 meters long, 1.5 meters in diameter, and weighed 19,000 kilograms, America's heaviest, largest airborne nuclear bomb. Even a B-36 needed 2 bomb bays to hold one. Beyond nuclear bombs, the Convair B-36 was the only plane able to carry the T-12 Cloudmaker bomb. This monstrous weapon weighed nearly 20,000 kilograms, equivalent to 2 Grand Slam bombs or 3.5 Tallboy bombs. Against such colossal bombs, the B-36 defensive armament seemed insignificant. It had 8 remotely controlled turrets, each armed with 2 20mm Hispano cannons. In an era when even the F-86 Sabre used .50 caliber guns, that was potent firepower. Yet during live-fire exercises, the recoil from the 20mm cannons often loosened turret wiring and damaged fragile vacuum tubes in the electronics, affecting the plane's controls and navigation. In that era of low component integration, such small flaws could be catastrophic. On November 22, 1950, a B-36B crashed during exercises. 2 crew members died during bailout after a turret wiring failure disrupted controls. Besides that accident, the B-36 experienced 2 broken arrow incidents. In February 1950, a B-36 crashed in a forest in British Columbia, Canada, carrying a Mark IV nuclear bomb. Fortunately, the bomb's fissile core was stored separately by the Atomic Energy Commission, making it incapable of a nuclear detonation. The other incident occurred in 1957 on U.S. soil. A B-36 ferrying a Mark 17 hydrogen bomb to Cortland Air Force Base experienced a loosened bomb rack on final approach. The bomb fell out near the runway, making a 7-meter crater. Although the warhead did not detonate, it was effectively an accidental bombing of American territory. Because of the B-36's enormous volume and unprecedented bomb bay capacity, it became a testbed for wild concepts. Beyond the ill-fated nuclear-powered propulsion projects, the most famous was the parasite plane, or mothership concept. The idea was to carry a fighter on board the bomber to escort the formation. It sounds bizarre, but it was a practical solution. At that time, no fighter could escort a super bomber with a combat range of 6,413 kilometers and a ferry range of 16,000 kilometers. World War II experience showed that unescorted strategic bombers penetrating deep into enemy territory, while not suicide, risked crews' lives for victory. If a parasite fighter could rendezvous, escort would be possible. The planned XF-85 Goblin parasite had to launch and retrieve via a retractable trapeze extending from the bomber's bomb bay. It had no landing gear. Instead, it had a retractable hook on its nose. Launch and recovery were like aerial refueling. The XF-85 would approach the B-36 from below, hook onto the trapeze, then be winched into the bomb bay. But in the pre-fly-by-wire era, the operation was like threading a needle in a storm. In 7 test flights, the XF-85 succeeded only 3 times. The other 4 times it belly landed. The Air Force concluded that even on clear days with an ace pilot, recovery was too difficult, and the portly XF-85 was underpowered. The project was abandoned. Yet the U.S. Air Force still needed an escort fighter. Further parasite plane research led to the FICON Fighter Conveyor project, which used a modified F-84. The concept was similar. During recovery, the F-84 would fly beneath the B-36, insert a retractable probe into a funnel on the bomber's trapeze, and be hoisted partly into the bomb bay, leaving only its wings and belly exposed. While far more practical, by the time FICON matured, its mission had shifted from escort to reconnaissance. In 1955, Soviet air defenses made large-scale, high-altitude reconnaissance flights almost impossible. FICON could carry a small reconnaissance jet, the RF-84F, to the Soviet border, release it for photo reconnaissance missions, then recover it at a prearranged rendezvous. Typically, a B-36 would take off from Fairchild Air Force Base in Washington, and the RF-84 from Moses Lake. After rendezvous, the RF-84 would be hoisted into the B-36, which would carry it near the target. The RF-84 pilot could then go to the bomber's crew area to rest for hours before returning to the fighter cockpit to conduct the mission. Given the B-36 ferry range of 16,000 kilometers and the RF-84F's range of about 3,200 kilometers, this system in theory could reach any point on the globe. Even more menacing, the RF-84F could carry a small nuclear weapon, meaning SAC could precisely strike any location worldwide. Although reliability was questionable, the system approached operational maturity. Despite FICON-modified B-36 being able to perform reconnaissance, the arrival of the U-2 high-altitude reconnaissance planes soon made them obsolete. And with the advent of surface-to-air missiles, both parasite fighters and bombers' gun turrets lost their value. Starting in 1954, the Air Force authorized Convair to strip weight from the B-36. The first to go were 6 rotating turrets, and eventually all facilities for parasite fighters were removed. 3 successive featherweight conversions reduced crew size from 15 to 9. The last 14 B-36J3 models retained only a radar-controlled tail turret. Space and weight savings went into extra fuel capacity, extending range and ceiling. By 1954, when production ended, each B-36 cost about $3.6 million. You might scoff at that, thinking a single Army tactical missile on a HIMARS costs $1.7 million today. But adjusted for gold prices at the time, $3.6 million in 1954 equates to over $300 million in today's dollars. And unlike later B-1B and B-2 Spirits, over 380 B-36 were built, more than the total of B-2 and B-1B combined. Plus, the B-36 served only 10 years, whereas the B-52, which entered service in 1961, has flown for over 6 decades. Considering those factors, the B-36 was extravagantly expensive. Even more importantly, because of the B-36's high cost and the Truman administration's favoritism toward Strategic Air Command, the B-36 became a thorn in the Navy's side. It indirectly led to the cancellation of the United States-class supercarrier, the suicide of the Secretary of Defense, and a vicious feud between the Navy and the Air Force, culminating in a sensational admiral's rebellion. If you'd like to learn more, leave a comment below. In future videos, we'll cover the full story of the admiral's mutiny and present our closing arguments on the controversies surrounding the B-36.